I've been an elected official almost all of my working life, including service on the city council. So I feel qualified to state with some authority that duly elected officials have been known to make mistakes. If one wasn't made in the 1960s when the city of Ventura decided to remove St. Mary's and city cemeteries, I submit that the way it was done was a mistake.
To the city of San Buenaventura, in writing this, I hope the Ventura City Council members will somehow find it within their hearts to make decisions to correct the moral, ethical errors and illegalities made by the city in the 1960s regarding St. Mary's Cemetery, now known as City Memorial Park.
San Buenaventura is often referred to as a hidden gem of Southern California. A quiet community nestled along scenic ocean views. A perfect place to raise a family. A city that is full of culture and history. Yet there is a dirty secret hidden in plain sight along East Main and Poli streets.
Welcome to News Talk 1520 KBTA, and we would like to say good afternoon to Steve, and I'm going to let you say your last name for us, please.
Steve Schlater.
Schlater. Welcome to News Talk 1520 KBTA about saving St. Mary's Cemetery.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What is the concern and what is the problem that we need to restore St. Mary's Cemetery?
Well, we've got a 7-acre cemetery with 3,000 people buried there. It's a pioneer cemetery that was started in 1862. Mm. And everybody who was anybody in Ventura is buried there. And the problem is that the city pulled out all of the headstones and threw them off a cliff into Arroyo Seco up in Hall Canyon in 1968.
Whoa.
And they thusly changed the 7-acre cemetery into a park, which is illegal.
A friend of mine, I had just moved to Ventura, 1990, and a friend of mine pulled up to the cemetery here and he says, hey, how you like the park? I go, this is a beautiful park. Gosh, it's just, you couldn't get a prettier one. It was a clear day. You could see the islands. It was just California perfect. He said, well, it's not really a park. There's 3,000 people buried here. Oh, give me a break, come on. I'm saying, I've got to tell people about this. This is wrong. Truth of the matter is, there's an elect in the echelon of the city. Ventura Cemetery and St. Mary's wasn't the only one that these characters had gotten a hold of. They tried to slam the door every chance they get, and they still do to this day. And that's what I would like to address. I want to find out why I'm the bad guy.
What does this city want to be branded as? Do we want to brand this city, San Buenaventura, as 7,000 desecrated graves by the sea, 3,000 at the cemetery, and 4,000 more underneath the Holy Cross School right next to the mission?
It is incredible, the eclectic collection of different walks of life that came here from all over the country, and for that much all over the world. You can walk through there and see some of the flush markers on the ground, and you can see the street names. The headstones are all gone. You can't walk through and tell a story about these headstones, these people. because they're all gone. That's been stolen. That's been vandalized. So it takes more for somebody to do the research, to know who's there, to study the plot plan. And most people aren't going to do anything like that.
Officially, I declare this as being the first day of the Renaissance of San Buenaventura.
12 years after Steve's testimony and a grand jury investigation, he continues to honor the 3,000 immigrants, veterans, and pioneers buried in what is now known as Cemetery Memorial Park.
We'll just have a simple allegiance and a prayer and a presentation of the colors and taps.
December 3rd, 1964, the city of Ventura, California demolished 3 pioneer cemeteries as part of a $12,000 transformation into a memorial park and viewpoint. Over 3,000 graves were desecrated. The cemetery was established in 1862. In 1889, the city assumed control of the non-Catholic portion of the cemetery, named City Cemetery. The last burial to take place was in 1944. Only 20 short years later, the desecration had begun.
They pulled out the headstones, some 600 headstones, at the Presbyterian and the Catholic section of the cemeteries. Took out in the neighborhood of 600 headstones and an incredible amount of curbs and cemetery furniture, grave copings, family curbs. All sorts of furniture has all been yanked and taken up into the hills in Hall Canyon. And there, eventually, the headstones were dumped off the cliff to the Arroyo Seco below, the dry creek bed. And they sat there for a few years, but the curiosity of Ventura citizens going down and carting them out. So at this point now, there are no headstones. Maybe 1 or 2. The rest are in the garages, in the backyards of everybody here in Ventura. Day after day after day, I'm doing research, and I'm bumping into names on documents, and I'm bumping into pictures about names, and you know, it's a big crossword puzzle, a big jigsaw puzzle coming together bit by bit. We all have DNA in our bodies that says that this is illegal, that this is wrong. It's an amazing, amazing process. The stuff that I had gathered, more and more articles, you name it, proved the fact that yes, this was a cemetery, and yes, it had been desecrated by the corporation of the city of San Buenaventura, and you know, the hell with everybody else.
Well, it's one mystery that just won't rest in peace. A man discovered an old tombstone in Woodland Hills, and now it's been traced to a graveyard with a controversy all of its own.
In this dark alleyway, beside a trash bin, a bizarre and macabre discovery.
And I see this tombstone, and I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe what I'm seeing.
It belonged to a James Sutton who died more than a century ago. But how did it end up behind David Minus's business here in Woodland Hills?
I would love to have it go back to where it was taken from.
I went to the city, I said, there's people buried in the parking lot. The Catholic Church told us there's nobody there, so there's nobody there. And we went into a big stink about that. The grand jury got involved with the graves underneath the parking lot. Park and Recreation Superintendent frauded the grand jury in order to get the city out of the jam with the grand jury. I had ground penetrating radar searching the parking lot and the ground in the front and the side of it.
It's the electromagnetic antenna. The bottom is one coil, top coil. The bottom coil pretty much puts out or induces into the earth an electromagnetic current, and that sees deep, whereas the top coil, it also induces a current into the earth, but it only penetrates down just a matter of perhaps 1 foot deep in the area. But the rest of the system is just towed back and forth in the collection of data within a grid, and we'll dump it down to a computer and have it, hopefully, the results.
From the city records, from the city burial records, we've surveyed the cemetery to get these particular locations of the graves that are underneath the parking lot. As you see right here, we have a number 26. That's block 1, grave number 26. Over here is block 1, grave number 17. We've got 7 graves here right underneath the parking lot. We were just looking at this photograph of this monument on top of this grave right here, and trying to triangulate it to this grave right here. We've got marked on the asphalt here, this 26. This 26 is John Riveron. He was buried here in 1911.
Oh, my maximum penetration is 2 feet.
Wow.
I know, that's not much at all. Any radar, they all have the same working principle.
Yeah.
It's going to be the same. I was going to bring an identical one to what they had, made by the same company,
right,
but it's on a job. But this is you know, comparable or even better.
The city had got their contractor who does all the ground penetrating radar for electrical lines, oil lines, you know, he has a contract to do everything. They had him go to the parking lot and say there's no graves there with his electronic stuff, and the place is clean as a whistle. And he came out with a report to that effect. I called Leo up, I said, could you come up? You know, he said, I'll be there next weekend. So he came up and did the land next to the parking lot. He went over to the parking lot and said, this is the newest equipment there is, and I can't get through the granite underlayment. I said, well, that's funny. The city's guy said they did and there's nothing there.
We're looking at basically these, you would expect that you would see stratigraphy and so forth, the layers in the earth. And that's what we're seeing, but this is 2 feet, 4, 6, and 8 feet down. There's actually only data happening, things are going on down to a depth of 2 feet maximum.
Oh, everything gets fuzzy after that.
Yeah, it's basically signal attenuation, which is nothing. It's like echoing. There's nothing. It's too conductive to penetrate.
If that's 2 feet, that's nothing.
Yeah, this is 4 feet.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the 2 foot mark.
Well,
maximum depth.
Shouldn't even be looking at anything in the 2 feet area.
I wouldn't suspect
for a grave.
Yeah, sadly, I don't think that this can answer any questions.
So you're just seeing the fill of what they use for the compaction underneath the parking lot.
We're basically getting down probably to where it's grade, you know, the graded point. That's it. It's still the cleanest earth I've seen. I mean, even Phil Whalen, our chief geophysicist, and my partner, he looked at it and he said that's very unusual that the earth would be that clean anywhere.
Even 18 inches to compact the soil before they laid this asphalt down.
Because there's got to be, I mean, from as old as this site is,
54?
There's debris. There's got to be debris. Yeah. For lack of a better word, you'd almost say it's too clean, you know?
But usually for a parking lot, when you put a parking lot in, is you don't grade it any deeper than 18 inches.
No, I mean, it's like...
Because your weights are trucks and cars, so there's no need to go deeper. But if they're going deeper for another reason that we don't know about, if they're excavating down 6 feet and coming in with new soil, it would look super clean.
If it's been touched by man, then there should be evidence of it. Sometimes the evidence is that it's just so clean, it's obviously been touched by man. Because this place has been occupied for, what, since the 1890s? Or what?
1862.
1862. Yeah, so there's got to be debris.
Yeah,
and the lack thereof is suspicious.
Where do you find clean dirt like that?
We import it. Import it from anywhere else. Grade it down and bring it in. The question is, what happened to the original dirt?
I wanted to call this other guy up who did the ground penetrating radar for the city. I called him up. I explained who I was, and I explained that I had a report from another ground penetrating radar company. And It was incredible because he started spilling his guts to me. He says, I was forced to put out that report. And he reiterated basically everything my guy told me, is that the superintendent had forced him, had given him initially a report that said, there's no way can I tell because of these problems. It was thrown back in his face. He says, you fix this report to say there's no graves in here, or you'll never work ground penetrating radar in the city again.
The neighborhood had enjoyed for 40 years this beautiful park overlooking the ocean, and they thought of it as a park, not as a cemetery. Everyone reserves the right to have an absolute moral judgment about what they think is right. But in a democracy, you have to listen to multiple voices and find a way to find common ground. This group of people wanted to be a park. This group of people wanted to be a cemetery. How do we reconcile them? Well, you can't. You literally can't. You can find some common ground. But if one group of people says this was a cemetery, it should be a cemetery for eternity, and this group of people says, well, for the last 40 years, this has been our park, and if you take it away, we have no park. There's really, that can become emotional, that can become controversial. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who say, well, why are you guys fighting about that? I have no idea why you are so obsessed with this particular issue. You look back at how we treat Native American burial sites, right? Well, if it's 40,000 years ago, we can dig it up and put them in museums because it's 40,000 years ago. But if it's white people 100 years ago, oh my goodness, we need to care about that.
AM 1400 KKZZ. It's interesting. There are a lot of big meetings on things going around, and one of the meetings was about the St. Mary's Cemetery, the dog park, if you will. I've got Stephen Schlater on the line.
You see, I 100% believe that the city has a predestined plan and is just going through lip service, a necessary evil, to make the people feel like they're inputting, that they're helping this along, and their thoughts, their recommendations are being completely discounted, and the city is going to get what the city wants. That's one of the big questions right now. Can we find a compromise it somehow? But for the life of me, I cannot compromise a man's grave for anything other than his grave. Right. I mean, how can we take 3,000 of our pioneer forefathers and compromise their grave? Who are we that can compromise anybody's grave? These are hallowed grounds. These are the holiest grounds inside the city of Ventura, and they've been turned into a dog toilet. When the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, gave St. Mary's to the city, there was one condition, that the property would be used to memorialize the dead. And if that was ever deviated from, the property would revert back to the church. Well, where is the church? Where is the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese, to say, hey, wait a second, this isn't memorializing the dead when you've got dogs pooping on the graves. We want to step in here and do something. Well, I'll answer my own question for you. The church, at least here in San Buenaventura, right next to the chapel, has the original mission cemetery that has 3,850 people buried in it, and the church put a schoolhouse right on top of those graves.
Right.
So the church isn't really wanting to get involved in this because they're knee-deep in it already by desecrating their own mission cemetery right next to the mission there. It would be incredibly intimidating if they were to stand up because they have so many ghosts in their closet, sort of say. They've got a desecrated cemetery right next to the chapel here in San Buenaventura. They've got a building on top of it, so you would never know that there ever was a dead person buried within 100 yards of the place. And they're also turning their back on 3,850 Catholics there at the Mission Cemetery and another 1,000 at St. Mary's. So they're even more culpable here than what the city of Ventura is.
The Catholic Church, what I read, is basically giving this up and also letting it deteriorate.
Yes, the culpability with the church is just as much as the city, if not more. They haven't been called to task on it yet, but that's that's in the process of starting to happen. They're just as culpable. And they have a nightmare that's just about to fall on them too.
The city actually had been maintaining both the Catholic and the Presbyterian sections for many years at no cost to them by getting road crews, prisoners, come twice a year and clean up everything, cut down the weeds, clean around the headstones, do all the tedious work that the city didn't want to pay for. And that was ongoing. It made it look respectable enough. They had stopped the road crews from coming in and doing the landscape maintenance, and they let the weeds grow to 8 feet tall because that gives them an excuse. They say the cemetery is now blight, good word, blight, and we are here to help you fix the situation. We are going to make things right.
And so why wasn't anybody paying attention, right? So 40 years later, people say, oh, I'm so offended that my ancestor was disrespected. Well, where were you for the last 40 years? Where was your family? Now, you might not be responsible because maybe your parents or your grandparents, but if this was happening, it was in plain view, right? It wasn't in a canyon 40 miles away covered by fog. This was on Main Street. And so if people were driving by and they were promised certain things and those things didn't happen and they were visiting the graves of their beloved ancestors every Memorial Day or on their birthday or on the anniversary of their passing, they would have said, well, where's the markers? But they didn't.
January 3rd, 1964, Ventura City Manager Charles Ryman sends letters to ancestors explaining the proposed improvements to the city cemetery. The city administrative assistant is quoted saying about 200 letters were sent out and nearly 100 were returned, all of them favoring the plan. Dr. James Dietz, UCSB colonial archaeologist, photographs the desecrated monuments.
Lupton has a ego and a pride problem. When he got so much response from desecrating this cemetery, the old cemetery on Main Street, that affected his pride, his ego. He was the go-to guy for this kind of thing, completely forgetting about what he was actually doing. Anything that feeds into somebody that's prideful is an addiction in a little bit. You know, you maybe have an opportunity to do more of this. Maybe you can get a name out of this. Motivation there that he had, it excited it. And it was an excitement like getting another fix of a drug. All-encompassing. It consumed him entirely. What is really condemning, the most thing that's condemning of him is that he writes a 5-page instructions on how to desecrate a cemetery and sends it to everybody who's interested in it. And in that manifesto, actually, the desecration manifesto, he actually explains when people come up with cameras to shut it down. and newspapers come, shut it down. People come, shut it down. That it's a covert action. If, you know, you're doing it on the up and up in the middle of the day, somebody walks over, you go, hi, you know, we got nothing to hide. So that really puts a shadow over the whole operation, right from beginning and end. You know, he doesn't want to confront the obvious publicly. He's hiding around corners. There was the meeting of the minds to look at their options, how they could cover their butts tactically, and I think they came up with this idea is that we're going to have an interface with the city, the descendants, that will justify what we're doing. We have to make it look like we were sensitive to the residents and the descendants, and we have their feedback and their green light. You know, they would, whatever they got back, they didn't really care. They were going to use it as an excuse to do what they're doing. It was a tactical, political movement of manipulating the situation for their own end goal. If all these people came back with letters that said, don't touch their grave or we're going to sue you, and there was a bunch of them, they would still go ahead and do what they were going to do. Because, you know, they have a staff of 5 attorneys full time. They can handle that, and for the lawsuits, and if they couldn't, they would just subcontract it out to one of the other law firms in the county who owed them a dime, who were in the club. You know, it was a way of just covering your butt, you know? And it's hilarious that when we went through all the records, it revealed itself. It was a scam right from the get-go. They were using it for their own goals.
Some residents of Ventura are taking on City Hall in an effort to restore a public park back to its original purpose, a cemetery.
I would appreciate the headstones put back on my ancestors' graves, and I am sorry that they were ever removed. And my mother cried very hard when they sent her a letter saying that her headstone was removed from her mother's gravesite and that she had to find a way to come and get it. But my niece tells me that her mother and dad went to see about it, but they had to have a big, heavy crane or something to move it. Well, they didn't have access to that, and they quoted them a price for them that they would move the headstone for them, but the price to them was outrageous. So it just couldn't be done, and it just broke my mother's heart.
I just want to add that my mother's grandparents and her great-grandparents are buried in that cemetery, as well as there's up to at least 16 of my mother's relatives that are buried in that cemetery. And that's a lot, and for her to be able to afford to replace headstones or markers on all those sites would be impossible for her. And some of these family members that my mother has are founding fathers of this community, of this county.
The people started revealing themselves to me, their different lives, their different styles, the history, what they did for Ventura, what they did for the West Coast. Ventura is small enough up till, you know, the last 50 years. What was it like even way back then? These guys were 8-foot pioneers. They were big, big people. And I just realized to myself, well, I've got to do something, because if I do not, I will not respect myself ever again. I felt a little bit selfish because I was on my way finishing my sailboat and taking off sailing and kind of like breaking free of the whole system, from getting away from the grid. And I was real close to getting there. And I thought, you know, if I took off and found paradise on some island someplace, this would always be in the back of my head that I walked away from these folks.
It took her a year, but by October 28, 1889, she was able to order a tombstone of white marble, 5 to 10 feet high, topped by a cross, for the sum of $125, about $3,600 in today's money. This is one of the tombstones still missing in action, probably at the bottom of Hall Canyon or washed out to sea. Not only did my great-grandmother pay for the tombstone at great sacrifice, she also paid for the land in which he and she remain buried, along with 7 other family members. Is ground hollow or sacred because it's been blessed by a priest, or is it hollowed because the bodies are buried there? Whatever the reason, there's no question in my mind that the ground is sacred ground, and I would like to see it treated as such.
Silverio, my grandfather, who died in 1926 and was buried in St. Mary's, surrounded by family members of the Lorenzana family. I never met him, but when I was very young, I came to St. Mary's Cemetery and pulled weeds around his and other grave sites with my father. He would read the headstones to me and would explain what the infantry was and what the Spanish-American War was all about. This gave me the only connection I would ever have to a grandfather that I would never know.
This is a federally recognized marker that is to be placed across the country on people who fought in the Civil War. They're all the same. They come from the same marble quarry. They don't ask for flush markers. They ask for this type of a marker.
If you go today and have a look at the Oliva markers, you'll see that they're located right next to the curb at the edge of the cemetery, which means there must be people interred under the parking lot.
I did say that if you're not going to return it to a graveyard and restore the place, because it is, it's history of Ventura County, you should name it the Rodney Dangerfield Park, because those people aren't getting any respect.
An effort to resurrect an old cemetery in Ventura is gaining momentum tonight, trying to return dignity to the people buried there, calling the city's attitude disrespectful.
7 acres of rolling seaside park where neighbors let their dogs run. But to preservationists, it's something much worse.
This is grave desecration at its most evil.
If you look closely, you'll find a few dozen grave markers, the only indication of the 3,000 people buried here. Robin Blanchard says she has over 100 relatives buried here. She wants the city to restore this park to what it once was.
It just makes me angry that the people that bring their dogs here feel that they're entitled to let their dogs run.
Schlater now among a growing number in Ventura, pushing for complete restoration as the fight for this seaside cemetery lives on.
Private James Sumner fought against Cochise in the Indian Wars.
He fought valiantly, was seriously wounded.
Gunny, that's what they call him, says Sumner eventually moved to Ventura County, where he died in 1912, and as depicted in this military funeral reenactment, was buried in Ventura Cemetery Memorial Park.
I don't want to get up in front of a city council and tell them what buttheads they are.
Is that how you feel?
That's exactly how I feel.
You feel like they're
buttheads.
I would say if you're going to move one Medal of Honor recipient, you should also move the other 80 veterans that are buried here too.
You don't want to see him move?
I would rather not have him moved.
We haven't had to answer this kind of question in decades. So somebody has to make a decision, and I think that given the timeliness, as you've said, of Memorial Day, maybe it's time to make a decision.
The city notified the families of the deceased of the planned development by mail, sent letters to all local churches, and published articles about the project in local newspapers. And at this time, people were given the option to take the headstones. Is that correct? And did some people come claim the headstones before they were all, and then what happened to the rest of them?
We began moving the headstones in 1964. There was about 600 headstones that were moved to a park, what then was a park department site, where they had their office space and their yard. It's now the Hall Canyon Reservoir.
I came to the realization that something had to be done, and I couldn't be like the other 108,000 people in Ventura. Somebody had to say something. And I had my personal dreams and aspirations and goals in my life, and that was a full-time job. But it seemed like if I made a decision to do something, I'm gonna have to give up something, so the chips were on the table. It wasn't just a fad or a fashion or just kind of a cool thing to get into. It could take some real commitment, and at that time I had no idea how much. How do you look into a deep well and know how deep the thing is?
Forsaken, you see the headstones they bought, from earning the money and hard work and the wars that they fought, whose families that came from so far and near, who traveled by stagecoach and got off a ship at Ventura's pier. They laid our roads, our buildings, and even our houses, and after all their hard work, they took time to bury their children and spouses. They came to Ventura with their golden dreams, only to be laid to rest and disrespected, it seems. A cemetery is a place of rest for our historical past, a place that is sacred and meant to last. America the beautiful, and so it should be. Cemeteries were made for preserving our nation's history. In the land of the free and the home of the brave, everyone deserves a respected grave. We must restore this place to what it was meant to be, so we can honor our heroes and be with family. To change this dog park back to a final place of rest is a decision we the people think will be the best. From out of the light and into the dark, a cemetery is a cemetery and no place for a dog park. Thank you.
Somehow or another, I found out about a Freedom of Information Act. I had no idea what that was. And I found out that the city was a public corporation and could not conceal, or supposedly could not conceal anything from the public because they work for the public. So I could solicit them with the Freedom of Information Act and request documentation anytime in the past on anything. So I started asking them for Freedom of Information Act stuff. And one of the first things I asked them for was the burial list. Who's buried there? I wanted to see if there was actual record of the people buried there. And this is back when I didn't know anything. Nobody knew anything. There was nobody talking about the cemetery. So when I actually got the list, and I sat there for probably weeks, just going through the list page by page. And without any instruction, without anybody mentoring me, you could actually see the history coming out of these pages, the people that were listed here, the day they died, how old they were, where they're buried. The history comes out of those pages like you wouldn't believe. And it took a human face, it took a human soul that I was starting to see out of this. And I kind of got pulled into it even more. You know, I was still kind of on the fringe. I probably could have walked away. The soul of Ventura was there. These people that could not defend themselves anymore were, in a way, talking to me. They're sharing their lives with me. And it intrigued me even more. And I said, well, now I know who's here. So I went back to the clerk's office and I put in another request for the plot plan. I had heard that they knew where everybody was buried. And it shows where every grave is and their names are on the grave. And so then I could get another dimension to the whole story. Not only did I have who was here, but a three-dimensional was showing me who was buried next to who. What kind of relationships did they have when they were living? Families were buried with family, and there was soldiers who were buried with soldiers, and it was incredible what was being shown to me.
My name is Gregory Freeman Webster. My great-great-great-grandfather was buried at Cemetery Park in a 10-by-20 plot. As I got older, started hanging out with my grandpa, James Brackett Webster, I learned more about the family history and how my great-great-great-grandfather was postmaster, and started wondering and found out about the cemetery. My dad took my grandpa Jim down to City Hall to speak about it and met Steve Schlater and went to a few city council meetings and spoke and asked him, please don't make this a dog park. My family's buried here.
My great-grandfather, Ellis Webster, was released from the Andersonville prison in about April 15th of 65. He and his buddy, Mr. Bradley, whose Bradley Avenue in Somas is named for, went back up the railway, granted freed it up, and they went to Put-in Bay, Ohio, and picked up his new wife and had the baby, which was my grandfather, H. Bay Webster, and they came to this country, Ventura, in 1871. The Websters have been here for about 137 years. Great Alec Webster was a great literary man. He was chopping wood one time before the Battle of Gettysburg, And in doing so, he looked down, and there was a tall, skinny fellow with short pants, and he said, "Fella, let me show you, soldier, how to chop wood," and it was Lincoln.
They still voted to make it a dog park, which is humiliating to my family. I'm speechless. I'm just speechless how somebody could desecrate military veterans' graves and get away with it. City officials, they might sweep it under the rug, but we're not going anywhere. One day, somebody's gonna come along with a backbone and restore this cemetery. Someone's gonna do it. It's not a dog park, folks. This is a cemetery where my family is buried. I did more research with Steve Schlater and found that they dumped a lot of the headstones in Hall Canyon. I took it upon myself to go hike up and down Hall Canyon hoping I can find my family's federal issued headstone, and was turning over rocks, and I found this great big plot marker, Johnson family plot marker. I just couldn't believe that they were down there. They had to get removed. They had to be stored in a safe place so that they could be put back.
GW. Oh, it's coming back down. Wait, it's on south. Oh.
You wanna, you gotta stand for something or you'll fall for anything. You can't just let this go. I commend Steve Schlater. He's done a wonderful job of standing up to these people. Steve has definitely put himself out there to be slandered and walked on and trashed. And he's got a lot of guts for standing up to the city hall. And it's not an easy thing to do, and people say don't do it, and that's kind of why all this is happening, because no one council member will stand up.
Well, they haven't done anything legal to begin with. It's all illegal. From the Park Service at the Mojave Desert, they had found a abandoned headstone, and they had tracked it to St. Mary's here in Ventura. They looked at it as something being very serious because it's a federal national park, so everything has to be reported. It was pretty evident a crime had occurred. They didn't know where the headstone came from, or there was even speculation that maybe somebody was buried there. But further research proved that the way that they found it, the circumstance was, it seemed like it wasn't too far from the road, the highway, and somebody had just pulled over and dumped it out. And it wasn't sitting on its face, it was kind of, sitting in the dirt on one corner. How do you put a headstone in your car, drive all the way out to the Mojave Desert, and just pull over and dump the headstone out on the side of the street, side of the highway? I mean, that's great, nobody's gonna find it, and it's so far away from Ventura. I mean, and it took no time at all to find out exactly it came from Ventura. You try to desecrate a cemetery, and people come and get the headstones, and they're scattered all over the place, and it's just karma. All of a sudden, San Diego calls up and says, "Hey, we have a headstone here." It's like, what? It's the crime all over again. It's all of the bad karma coming back. It's like they can't hide it. It will not go away. It continuously haunts them. From Medford, a headstone is found. From Reno, Nevada, a headstone is found. All these places, karma's coming back. They were so negative, and now all that energy is coming back on them and bringing the desecration up. Every few months, it happens again. Everybody else understands that a headstone in Tost is a crime. Everybody knew that headstones belong on graves, and Ventura still can't get that through their head.
It's been 10 years since I've talked to Steve, and I haven't followed what's unfolded closely. Like a lot of people who have a single focus, he sees the world in very black and white terms. There's a place in any society for the prophetic voice, and woe unto us if we ignore the prophetic voice. But we have a lot of prophetic voices, and they have different truths. And sometimes when they insist that it ought to be 100% their way because they're right, you have to examine that. Steve has chosen to pour his energy into saying this contested piece of land in Midtown Ventura was a cemetery 100 years ago, should forever be a cemetery as it was as much as possible 100 years ago. I hear that voice. I'm not sure it's the voice of absolute truth, but for Steve it is.
I would like to ask the police chief, Chief Corney, to arrest each and every one of you this evening and hold you for 72 hours for a psychological evaluation, because the harm that you present to yourselves and to the community is over the top. I'm seriously believe that you cannot be sane and support a desecrated cemetery. I'm serious.
And?
Do you know what happened to the bodies that were exhumed? Or, I mean, have you heard anything about that, or is that not?
During the making of this film, an incriminating letter was discovered. After a 14-year fight with the city, this is the first time Steve has seen the letter.
The park director has informed me that you have completed the transfer of remains that were moved because of the repairs to the Civic Recreation Center. Well, this is proof of what we thought the whole time, and we could never prove. We couldn't find the murder weapon. And this letter is the murder weapon. This is tangible proof. But I just had a gut feeling there was people underneath the rec center, and we've always known for years and years and years that there was people underneath the parking lot, 7 people. I just never went to think that if they put a parking lot on top of 7 Catholics, they're gonna put a building on top of who's ever there too. I mean, they're not gonna move anybody. And I think this is the crux of the whole thing right here. This is why they're scrambling and lying and doing all the things that they've done since day one, is to hide the fact that they built right on top of graves. They've known it all the way along, and so is the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. They've known they've built right on top of graves.
As you know, the cemetery developed with different pieces over different years, right? So there was a period probably when Native American remains were on the site. There was certainly different faiths: Jewish faith, Protestant faith, Catholic faith, St. Mary's Cemetery. Not completely accurate records, as I understand it, were kept of where everybody was. And so I think there was, again, when I went back through the record, I found that there was controversy over that, and so we commissioned actually a study, and we went over the ground to see if we could forensically unearth what the actual history was and whether there were bodies of loved ones that were buried in particular places. I don't remember all the details of that. It's been 10 years, but I do remember that we really tried to go back and figure all that out, and if new evidence has surfaced that would shed light on that, I think that's helpful.
One of the rumors that is going around town is that the cemetery's been desecrated for 40 years, and now why the big stink? Yeah. And I wanted to prove that this big stink has been going on before the city actually grabbed the cemetery. So what I got here, this is a 1922 photograph, a 1929, excuse me, overhead photograph of the cemetery. Here's the Catholic section, and you can see trees planted in a giant cross. And here's the Presbyterian section that shows the cemetery. This is a walkway, just a path that people have traveled through. And then the next photograph, here is a 1946 photograph, and you see the trees aren't as distinct anymore that show the cross here in the Catholic side. And a lot of other bushes have been planted up here. And there's some grass and whatnot, the walkways. This is 1946, right after the war. Okay, so then what we have is, this is 1958. And
I notice a difference here.
A big difference.
What are these white things on the Protestant side here?
Well, first of all, this was the recreation center that was put in by the city on the Western 110.
Yeah, I remember that. I used to go there as a kid.
Right. There's some graves underneath the parking lot that everybody's denying, but the burial list says that they're there. And as you can see, this is 58. It was put in, the rec center was put in 55. But what you have here is, it looks like, from my interpretation, is all of the descendants went to their families' graves and poured concrete copings over the top of their graves to protect them from the pending encroachment, the interpreted encroachment by the city. If the city had grabbed this, there was a rumor out, I guess, that the city was going to come after the whole cemetery. The recreation center, the history of that, it slipped on the foundation, and they had to red tag their own building, and they couldn't use it, so they went in and put pilings along the foundation, concrete pilings into the dirt, to try and keep the building from slipping anymore, to try and save the entire structure, and it didn't work. And where they chose to put the pilings in the floor of the rec center, they happened to go right in through coffins and graves. And this letter is to not acknowledge the fact that the last of those remains have been removed, so they can go ahead and put the concrete pilings in to keep the rec center from sliding more. So this is the smoking gun right here. This is the proof. It's got to be against the law. This has got to be against the law, and this is why they've been hiding it, going everywhere to deny exactly this. And the wording is so condemning.
People said, well, it's old cemetery. It's overgrown. It's falling apart. Why would we put money into that? Was it intentional in the sense of some Machiavellian conspiracy? Well, I wasn't there. I don't know. But actually, people make up more Machiavellian conspiracies than happen. I've been in the public sector for a long time. I know that mostly we put our pants on one leg at a time, and we try to get through the day and try to do a good job. We all have our blind spots. I worry what 40 years from now people will look back and say, what were they thinking? But if you look back 40 years and you say, well, why would they let this beautiful setting that contains so much history, why would they let that slip away? I think the answer was they were looking ahead and not behind.
Reardon's connection to this whole desecration still hasn't shown its entirety. There's a lot more stuff here. Reardon was the county coroner, a paid job. He worked also on the city council, and then he had his own business as the mortuary just down the street. There's a lot of strange stuff there. There's kind of a conflict of interest that he covered everything that had to do with people dying, a coroner. He had the entire market covered up, which is really bizarre. I think that there is a conflict of interest. You can do one or the other, but you can't do it all. You can't corner the market like that. When we found that letter from the city manager, showed that those people's grave, that the coring company had gone into the coffins underneath the rec center, and that he had removed the bones, the remains of those three Catholics, was a horrible thing. It's a smoking gun. And what is more horrible is I looked for documentation for those three graves to be exhumed. Anywhere, it's the law in the county, law in any county, that if you're going to exhume bodies, you have to first get a permit to exhume a body, so they know where everything's moving around, the human remains. Well, there's no permits that I could find. And there's no reburials anywhere in the county at any of the cemeteries. And at that time, there wasn't any other way of getting rid of the remains, the human remains. So it's a big question, where are those 3 Catholics now? Their remains for their families. What did he do with them? Did he throw them in the trash, or are they sitting in a little trophy case someplace? You know, and he's the professional. He's the coroner for the county. He's the city councilman, and then he has his own business, and poof, 3 people are gone. It doesn't supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be the opposite of that. To entrust somebody in those 3 positions that have so much power, and something like this disappears, that's horrible.
Years later, cities throughout the country wrote Ventura asking how to desecrate their own pioneer cemeteries. Ventura's actions created a nationwide problem.
Ventura Cemetery in St. Mary's wasn't the only one that these characters had gotten a hold of. The Archdiocese information made it very clear that the city of Whittier, the corporation City of Whittier, and the corporation of the city of San Diego were right in there, wanted to get rid of their pioneer cemeteries too, and had contacted Ed Lupton in the city of Ventura and were in full agreement to do it. They wanted to get rid of that piece of real estate, that mentality at that time and period, like right at the end of the Vietnam War, basically, the end of the 60s, 1972, 1975, I think they went down to San Diego and did it to that Calvary Cemetery. It was like all hell had broken loose. It was like a madman had gotten sponsorship, mass desecrating graves. He was like all of a sudden given a license to do this everywhere. And like he says here, I had pride. I had pride to see a desecrated cemetery. That's upside down and inside out. And Lupton was supposed to be a Catholic. And he filled the role so well. He went on to write this letter that I've dubbed How to Desecrate a Cemetery. And it's 4 pages that actually goes through and says, if you see people walking up with cameras or the newspapers, put your shovels down, stop everything, and go away until they've gone home.
Ed Lupton volunteered to take photographs of each crypt being opened.
Well, one of my first thoughts about those people where they opened up the mausoleums and the tombs and laid their bones out on a blanket with the jewelry and whatnot, I felt for the people to be exposed like this. There's a thing called dignity in death. And to have your tomb opened up and your remains displayed like it's a carnival exhibit is humiliating to anybody. I was horrified. Horrified. I mean, this is crazy stuff, man. This is as crazy as it gets. They stole everything from these people. They stole everything, you know? And they've never said they're sorry to this day. And then they go and they backstab the descendants and me every chance they get. They have no interest in making it the slightest bit more of a cemetery than what it is right now. They refuse to. They want a desecrated cemetery.
54 years later, there are still over 3,000 unmarked graves.
I want to know what my family is. They souls is not resting in peace.
The headstone was maybe about a half a block away.
Nobody can say for sure exactly how many thousands of people are buried in this 150-acre cemetery, leading the sheriff to suggest, short of digging up every grave and doing DNA testing, every family may never have complete resolution.
This is just sickening. Yeah, it really is. Pasco County deputies are looking for what may be suspected grave robbers.
A pair of graves desecrated at the Crystal Springs Cemetery in Zephyr Hills. And 10 News reporter Eric Glasser shows you why it's got so many people in this small community extremely upset.
Like I said before, this is a deep well, and it goes down, 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 down. And I've thrown rocks down there and never heard them hit bottom. So I don't know how bad these guys are. We all have DNA in our bodies that says that this is illegal, that this is wrong to desecrate somebody's grave. 1 grave or 3,000 graves. This is wrong. The only way, I think, to solve this is to get this situation to as many people as we can. When enough of people know about what's happening here, it will solve its own problem. It will just be done. The cemetery will be restored just as a byproduct of what's going on in people's minds and hearts. Not only here at this cemetery, but cemeteries all over the country. We'll start taking our heritage a little bit more responsibly, hopefully. Because we are our heritage. We're not the conquerors. We're the guys sitting on the giant's shoulders. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to our memorial today for Silverio Lorenzana. Silverio was one of 78 total veterans that is buried here in the cemetery. And every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, we like to pick out one guy, one veteran, and honor him, including all the other veterans. And we come across Silverio this time. Spanish-American War, 1898. I really want to thank the extended family, the Lorenzana family here for showing up. I'm humbled to have them here with us. That's what this is about, is the family and the veterans. Just great to see some of the original pioneer families of the descendants here. Puts me over the top. I'm very humbled to have all of you here to protest exactly what the city has done, is doing. We've been fighting the city, I have, for 14 years, trying to get them to restore the cemetery. It's not only the descendants, they refuse to mark the graves of the veterans that are buried here, which is federal law, but we're still fighting. You know, and that's why we're all here, because we're not going to give up. This cemetery is a hard one to sell because it's in a desecrated state, and to have you people show up is fantastic, because we're literally the underdogs in the memorialization of our pioneers and our veterans. You could have went to Ivy Memorial or some of the other fancy places and got all the bells and whistles, and we don't have that to offer you, but what we do have is 78 guys that deserve the very best and aren't getting it if we don't show up, that we don't do it. City isn't going to come over here and do this. They're terrible people. Your shells here.